my pleasure to bring you a practical example of how I think the Tal-Botvinnik series can be applied in your own games and 50 years later. I played this game recently and I felt, obviously I've spent a lot of time thinking about Tal-Botvinnik recently, but I felt I was able to bring some of the qualities of those games to this one. So I'm playing in this game a FIDE Master who's reasonably strong named Andy Lee, and it was in the Northern California Championship that was played recently. I had a problem in general facing King's Indian players. I've done, I guess, in terms of statistically, I've done quite well, but nevertheless, I've been traumatized by the King's Indian, in particular because I believe in the King's Indian, and I knew that this particular player very much enjoyed the kind of initiative that the King's Indian often gives black. So one of the things I really wanted to focus on was Tal's sentiment of trying to get the kind of game that you want. And so right from the beginning, I wanted to get my opponent in a position where he's not going to get the kind of game that he wants. And let's see how that goes. I play d4, knight f6, knight f3, g6. And now instead of playing one of the more popular positions with c4, I played this move bishop g5, which is in some ways a joy kill for the black position. Now, let's take a look. We're going to see that white intends to put his knight here, and that knight in particular is kind of going to be the piece that, if anything, is a problem for white. And the reason is simply that on d2 he won't be as active as on c3. But the advantage of putting him on d2 is that I don't yet have to commit the c-pawn to c4, because I don't really want to put the knight in front of the c-pawn. If I put it in front of the c-pawn, then the c-pawn won't help me in the central fight. And one advantage could be, as we'll see in the game, that if I put the pawn on c3, that will blunt the power of black's g7 bishop. So why am I saying this? The reason is that knight e4 isn't such a strong move. Say something like this, because now I can develop the knight on the b1 knight successfully against using the fact that black put his own knight on e4. Okay, so black plays bishop g7, knight d2, and here he has his first real question of the game. I think the best move here is to play d5. Not only with the aim of stopping e4, but also with the very clear aim of just dominating this knight and saying, okay, white's not going to get some kind of a huge advantage here because the knight is poor. And if white has a poor piece, then he's not going to hurt me. And I think that's the correct way to play. Of course, then, though, he really has very little chance for an initiative. And this is very important to understand psychologically, because now I can play things like e3, bishop e2, castles, and I'm very solid. And King's Indian players really would rather have a small disadvantage than have a position where they have to think for themselves without the initiative. They want the initiative. They're greedy for it. And that's something here that we'll see in this game. Because after castles, e4, black plays d6. Now, this isn't a bad move, but now notice I've got this funny, like, Perk-style position where a lot of my pieces are in fact making sense, and I might even have something like an advantage right now. I think I do, in fact. It seems like all of the pieces are making reasonable sense. So, bishop d3 was played. Now, bishop c4 would be nice, but knight e4 I think is a hassle. The idea that knight e4, d5, and black seems okay. But maybe even that could be played. In any case, I played bishop d3, and now black was still playing quite quickly, and I think he had this idea already prepared. And that was h6, bishop h4, knight h5. Okay, and this looks a little frightening because even though this isn't a developing move, black has two ideas. One, to land the knight, and the other to play g5, g4, and win this pawn on d4. And so I have to here ask myself how I'm going to deal with both of those threats. Now, notice a move like knight b3 would solve those problems, say knight f4 castles. but I'm not giving black any reason to worry here. Not only can he steal my bishop on d3, but this knight on b3 makes no sense at all. I don't understand that knight. So I was very keen to make castles work. And this is the first point I felt I used the kind of, let's call it, foresight of Tal in terms of dealing with an attacking position. What I saw was, first of all, I want to make castles work, and I saw g5, bishop g3, g4, knight h4, bishop d4. And it's very important not to stop here, to keep going, and I saw knight f5 would be very strong. Bishop takes is forced, and now this guy is a problem. And here, honestly, I didn't spend too much time now from this position, because I saw there's only way to defend g4 would be knight f6. And then I have a move like knight e4. The bishop is loose. This guy's hanging. And if black ever plays h5, then queen d2, followed by the queen coming into the black position, will be very strong. So that was my general thinking here, and I think that's basically the case. And notice one of the things that has to kind of happen here is that white needs to trust in the dynamic features of his attacking position, and in fact be quite happy and hopeful if black goes for this. Okay, so all these attacking variations will always be underneath the surface of a chess game. And as I really predicted from the beginning, my opponent wanted no piece of being the passive partner in this game and played knight f4. Reasonable move. I think that's his best move. Bishop c4. I'm not going to give him the bishop. And of course now the bishop is a little bit more secure on c4 because of this trick. Knight e4 is no longer possible. But the knight on f4 is an annoying kind of looking guy, and I'm going to have some questions about how to deal with him. However, he's still behind in development. Now, black plays a move that can't be too bad in c6, controlling some squares, and I don't think d5 is so much an issue, but maybe queen c7. And here I make my one, I think, clear mistake of the game. And I think it's also, you can analyze it psychologically. The knight on f4 is annoying, and I immediately play bishop g3. I think this is a bad move. The knight's, it is an annoying personality on f4, but it right now isn't actually doing all that much. And what my bishop on h4 is doing is it's pinning this pawn and making it difficult for that pawn to move to e5, which it would like to do, and also, inhibits a structure like queen c7, knight d7. And I'm not worried too much about g5 because that weakens a lot of the squares around the black king. So I think the better move here than bishop g3 would have been just play rook e1. Just a solid developing move, and if queen c7, which I think is probably black's best move, then e5 is reasonable. With, I think, a small advantage. Obviously the game's going to go on, maybe bishop e6, but there's some grief here for black. In particular, he can't move the knight here because this pawn's hanging. Okay, so I made a mistake. And one of the things about the Tal-Botvinnik series is a lot of mistakes are made. And, at one level, for us players that aren't as strong as Tal-Botvinnik, it's comforting psychologically to realize that these players make mistakes. But also very important to see is the psychological awareness of both players that mistakes will happen, and not to get psychologically wound up in the mistakes you've made in the game. Okay, e5 is played. Absolutely correct. Now, if bishop f4, he takes, and at least in this position, he's got a pleasant position where I'd rather be black. The two bishops, and this guy's strong, and this pawn is not a bad pawn and can eventually lead to some kind of counterattack, perhaps, with g5 later. So, now I think in this position black is fundamentally okay. I played c3. Okay, now here I feel black makes a serious error. And it's hard to actually find many improvements for black after this error. To my mind, black's position is, I don't know if he's better here, but it's rather pleasant. In particular because I think it's easier for him to play. My sensibility here for black would be to play a plan like queen f6, knight d7. You could play knight d7 first. I don't think it makes much of a difference. And then try to play with the strong point f4, and maybe even play a plan like rook e8, knight f8, knight e6. And just strengthen the dark squares and force white at some point to commit this pawn on d4. Now, we're going to see, I think, that part of black's mistake here is born out of not realizing that this bishop is very strong on this diagonal. And really, it's very important on that diagonal to create counter threats using that knight on f4. We can imagine all kinds of grief might happen to me on those white squares with the bishop on g4. Maybe someday even bishop h3 happens to me. All these things are potentialities. And the rook has to wait on a8. That's just what he has to do for a little bit. And that's typical of King's Indian style positions. But my opponent got in his head that the bishop needed to go to b7 in order to be developed. And we're going to see that this is a big mistake. And he plays b5, bishop b3, bishop b7. So he's thinking knight d7, and maybe someday c5. And, at first when I saw this, I was obviously happy, but it wasn't necessarily clear to me that I would be that much better. But I came upon a nice plan. And the plan we're going to see is actually very difficult for black to face. But I want to stress that during the game, it's not like I somehow saw to the end of the game. I was really mainly looking to try to find the best placement of my pieces. And we're going to see that from that placement, that's really what gives black grief. Okay, now the first thing I'm looking at in this position was that this bishop was funny. Now, we're going to see that in a lot of situations, in chess situations in general, a bad piece will lead to some kind of grind. But here, this is a far more fast-paced situation where I have to be move for move very careful that that bishop doesn't become activated. If it does become activated, then his plan makes sense. And that's why this is going to take a tactical turn fairly quickly. Also, one thing just positionally to be stressed is, since that bishop left these squares, okay, this is going to seem abstract at first, but I think we're going to see this during the game. Since that bishop left that diagonal, this bishop actually gained in strength. Not only against this square, but we're going to see that squares like this, f5, are also going to become tragically weakened because the bishop left that diagonal. Okay, so I came up with a plan here. First thing, a4. Now, this is the second problem of black's setup here with b5, bishop b7, is that b5, the b5 pawn, can now be used as a lever, kind of similarly to how it's used as a lever in the Ruy-Lopez. Okay, black played a6, and I took. Now at this point, black could play cb, but it's important to see that here he would be admitting that I have the advantage. The pawn structures would be split, this would be a weakness, and at any point I can shut this bishop down with d5. Okay, so he plays the natural move, ab, takes. And I had seen this in other positions, that the bishop is now unfortunate on a8. It's unfortunate for two reasons. One, it can be a target for, say, a rook on a1. And also, it's now takes two tempi to get the bishop to c8. Okay, so here was my notion. I need to prevent c5 from happening. Now notice, it is true that I can shut down the bishop with d5 once c5 is played. However, if I do that, my own bishop, my own light square bishop, also suffers. And I wanted no part of that. So now I took, and it's important to see that the main reason I'm taking now isn't so much the structure of the getting this double pawn, but so that my queen can come to e2. And let's talk about this queen on e2 for a second. Okay, first point. By hitting that pawn, we are making c5 more difficult. There's other ideas as well. One is e5, and we're also going to see there's a very tricky idea that the queen wants to stay on this diagonal, and we're going to see that later. And of course, she's freeing the way for the rook to come to a1 where it's going to make sense. Now, the other thing that needs to be pointed out is that, when I first looked at this plan, there was a little part of me that was like, I'm not sure about the queen on e2, because, quite rightly, there's a lot of grief involved with maybe a file hitting the rook hitting the queen, and that in particular could really inhibit the plan like e5. However, the other thing to really notice here is that once the rook goes to e8, then this square in f7 becomes weak, and of course when that square becomes weak, that means that this bishop becomes strong. We're going to see this bishop is slowly evolving into a super bishop, and again, one of the reasons that's happening is that this guy is out of play on a8. Okay, my opponent plays a natural move, knight d7, and now I play rook a1. Okay, so I think white has a reasonable advantage. One thing I want to point out, though, is that all of my pieces are making sense, except perhaps this knight on d2. He needs a little bit of help. And he's dreaming either that this guy on f3 moves, or that the pawn on e4 moves so that he can come to e4. But other than that, all of white's pieces are really strong. And in particular, let's just pay attention now to this bishop on b3 that has really gained in strength. Now, let me just say again, I didn't know exactly what was going on here. It's hard to calculate all kinds of variations. But one of the things I realized was if the queen goes away to deal with this a7 business, then I might have knight h4. And again, I wasn't sure. It was very complicated, and to calculate that in advance is a bit of a hassle, especially when this plan makes sense anyways. I shouldn't put it like that to say it's a hassle. It's the wrong time to start calculating it. You have to calculate something that's going to be as delicate as this knight h4 move when you get there. Especially if all of your moves leading up to that point are making sense. And it's not like if black plays a move like queen b8 and I don't have knight h4 that I'm in huge trouble. But black would probably be okay, it is true, if I didn't have knight h4. Notice, before we look at queen b8, that move like rook e8 is not going to work out well because I do penetrate, and it's very difficult now for the queen to oust me because I'm touching the rook, and then, I'm touching the knight with the rook, and the knight, of course, can't move because of the weak f7 square. Okay. So my opponent plays a very logical-looking move, queen b8, and this does several things. It takes away a7 from my rook. It prepares c5 because it's protecting the b5 pawn, and it inhibits e5 because the queen's looking at that square. So a very multi-purpose move. But, of course, it lost a function by going to b8. And here I had to spend a bit of time analyzing knight h4. And this is where I really think the Tal-Botvinnik situation helped me here, is that, first of all, Tal had an amazing, I think, sensibility for the attack. And not only being able to calculate, in fact, in some ways his calculation was poor, but to sense where things should go and to have a fantasy about finding a way in. And so I think there's two parts of that. One, you sniff something out, but once you sniff something out, like you feel like something's wrong with the black position, like I did here, then you really have to force yourself to look deeply to find something magical to crack the black position. And that fantasy, as I think I saw from the Tal games, is what I applied here. Now, I'm threatening g6, so king h8 is just about the only move. Notice, if king h7, then I can play queen g4, knight f6, queen takes, g5 check, and of course I've just won a pawn. So, king h8 is played, and now, I think an earlier me might have said, okay, if queen g4, knight f6, queen f4, g5, then I'm losing a piece. However, like I'm saying with the Tal analysis, I wanted to look deeper and try to find a way in. In fact, of course, I have to find it before I play knight h4. And here was the idea that I found. Queen g4, played anyway. Knight f6, queen takes pawn. g5. Of course, if black doesn't have g5, that's it, right? I'm just up a nice pawn. Queen f5. Now, g takes h, and e5. We're going to see e5 is quite strong. But before we do that, I want to show you another interesting variation. Bishop b7 is an important variation to think about. And in fact, it might be black's best move. The point behind bishop b7 is that if I play knight hf3, he has bishop c8, and in fact he's winning. My queen's trapped. And I want to stress here that this really illustrates to my mind that the aesthetic and positional qualities of the bishop on a, if it could just get back to these light squares, none of this grief that we're going to see happening to him in the game would happen to him. Nevertheless, I think it's still a little bit too late, and the point would be bishop b7, e5, takes, bishop c8. Now, if I went back, maybe black could survive this position because he's got the two bishops. Well, white's still probably a little bit better. But white has something much stronger in pawn takes knight, bishop takes queen, pawn takes bishop, king takes, knight takes. And we have three pieces for the queen. And this is, I think, an instructive three pieces for the queen situation. Because white's advantage here is very much accentuated by the fact that I have the weak light squares, and I have the light square bishop. So, in particular, the square f5, where I'm going to be for the rest of the game, and it's going to make black's life very difficult. So this is either a clear advantage or white's winning. And notice that part of the positional motivation behind this variation that we're looking at is I'm encouraging black to play g5 here. And that g5 move is giving me some key weaknesses. Alright, so queen f5 takes knight, e5. He takes. Now, I think queen c8 is probably his only chance to really survive here, but that's also very unpleasant. I think the variation would go like this. Queen c8 takes, knight e4. Notice this bishop on a8 is still very poor. And the knight's coming in because bishop e7, trying to guard all the knight's entrance squares, won't work out too well to rook a7. So either winning or a clear advantage to white. Okay. So, in the game, black played queen d8, thinking that maybe he would survive after, say, takes. However, there's this nasty little in-between move here, bishop c2. And now black, in fact, has to resign because the knights can't move, and I'm going to take it next move. If queen c8 now, then I can take, and I throw in this in-between check on g7 because I can take the queen next on f5, being a piece up. So this to me was a very interesting game in a number of respects. Not only the aspect of, say, learning from Tal, but just the idea that if you study a person's games enough and come to an understanding of how they play, you can sometimes, I think, use their qualities over the board. So, this is GM Jesse Cry, hoping you enjoyed the game. Bye-bye.
This is Grandmaster Damian Lemos here for OnlineChessLessons.net. First of all, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you would like to receive more free chess videos from us, you can just click the subscribe button below. I would also highly recommend signing up for my free mail course, the 10 Grandmaster Secrets to Dominate Chess. During this exclusive course from OnlineChessLessons.net, I'll share with you my own Grandmaster shortcuts to effective attacking, defending, and growth hacks to improving your chess without complicated books or memorization. So sign up by clicking the sidebar on the right, and I know you won't be disappointed. Once more, this is Damian for OnlineChessLessons.net, and I'll see you in my videos. Thank you.